take their seats for the event. Great. So, Toyus, I've read this report you sent me last week called Making Peace with Nature. It was really a fascinating read, actually.
Yeah, wasn't it? But I wonder, Björn, what do you make of the title, Making Peace with Nature? I mean, the report goes pretty far in stating how destructive our relation to our environment is, and thinking about it and looking at this great view here, it seems like our society is just out to dominate, like conquer and dominate more and more nature.
Well, I think the report really starts with talking about three main issues, kind of planetary crises, you could say. The first is the climate crisis, the second is the biodiversity crisis, and the third is the waste and pollution crisis. But you asked about what it means to make peace with nature. I think it's about, how can we create a society that's fair and just, where people lead good lives, but where we live within planetary boundaries and where nature is allowed to flourish. So it's quite a tall order, I think, to ask. And the question in my mind is how we're going to transform. Transformation is a big word, and it could mean a lot of things to many people. So I struggle with that.
Yeah, and I think that's a difficult question, but I also think that's why we're here in front of this audience, and why we invited a mixed group of people with a variety of perspectives to kind of get some input into exactly that question. Mm-hmm. So let's just get started.
But are you not forgetting one thing, Torius? Should we not introduce ourselves?
Of course. My name is Torius Ekhoff. I work at GRID-Arendal. We just located down there at Tyholmen. This is my dear colleague, Björn Alftan.
Yeah, and well, thank you, Torius. But let's not forget there's an audience live streaming who's joining us. So we have Inga Anderson, who will join us from Nairobi, and also other people joining us live. And they're able to pose questions, so we'll hopefully get to that during the... I'd like to call our first speaker, who's Inga Anderson. Inga Anderson is the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP for short, and also the Under Secretary-General of the United Nations. In a previous post, she was also Director General of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, more commonly known as IUCN. So Inga, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to both you, Björn, and to Torius for hosting, and of course to Secretary of State Maren Haslet-Holsen, and to everyone at GRID-Arendal for inviting us and for the great partnership that we have. I send you greetings from a very cold Nairobi. Now you're in Norway, so you will ask what's very cold, but it is really cold. It's around 15 degrees, and but when it's 15 outside, it's also 15 inside, because houses don't have the kind of build that they have in the north. So at any rate, it's very good to be here today. And this title of Making Peace with Nature was taken from the speech of the Secretary-General António Guterres. He made a State of the Planet speech back in, I want to say, December of last year, which he titled Making Peace with the Planet, and Making Peace with Nature, excuse me. And so that is why we took this report that exactly follows his lead and took that title. And you're referring to our report, and thank you for that. I want to refer to just a week ago when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, issued what António Guterres has called the Code Red for Humanity, reminding us again that climate change is here and it's getting worse faster. And as we're looking down the road of the future, we're seeing a global temperature rise that will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius this century. The 5 scenarios that the report outlines all have us crossing 1.5. So that, given the scientific projections, is a given, even if we pull the handbrake right now, which we must, of course. So we are looking at a future where the Arctic is likely to be sea ice free in September at least once before 2050. We're looking at a future where sea level rise continues unabated, We know that climate change is part and parcel of that triple planetary crisis, the crisis of climate, the crisis of biodiversity, and the crisis of pollution. And these crises are threatening our very existence. And that is why we're talking about making peace with nature. We failed to act. We failed to act fast enough on that triple crisis driven by humanity's unsustainable and frankly misguided consumption of our planet's resources. And we haven't done enough to protect the world's poor and most vulnerable. And we're learning now, a little late, that rich or poor, developed or developing, everyone will be affected. And we can't even say that we sleepwalked into this situation because the body of science has been available for decades, built by the likes of IPCC, the likes of IPBES, the likes of GRID-Arendal, and ourselves at UNEP, means that we've walked into it eyes wide open and awake as a humanity. So it's long time past to take that decisive action, to reform our societies and economies, our food systems, our energy systems, our transport systems, our consumption and production habits, our financial systems. It's long time past to make peace with nature, not just because we want to halt and reverse the crisis, because obviously we do, but because we want everyone's lives to be better than where they have been. We want peace, we want equity, opportunity, health, wealth, and happiness, and intergenerational justice. So friends, as we embark on what we now know we must do, namely a sort of global redesign, we must hold in our mind the benefits of nature-based solutions. We're talking about solutions that can provide up to 40% of the mitigation efforts needed until 2030 through natural carbon sinks. Now, while we urgently decarbonize our economies and societies, because let us be clear, nature-based solutions are not an alternative to decarbonization. We're talking about natural systems that buffer against storms and floods and zoonotic diseases. We're talking about healthy and diverse agriculture that uses natural solutions to control pests and fertilize soils and pollinate crops rather than input heavy, chemical-heavy monoculture systems. But before you begin discussing these solutions today, allow me to come up with some thoughts about how we can truly make that peace with nature, and a few points. First, my first point is to make sure that, and in no particular order, I should say, that we start accounting for nature, that we understand that nature has value. Now, this is not about commoditizing nature or putting dollars on trees, etc., that sometimes it gets, but it's just a simple fact that if we don't value nature intact as providing that service that we, humanity, need, we're going to destroy it. And anyway, we're going to have a heavy price to pay. So the inclusive wealth measure is one that measures growth not just along produced and human capital, but also the natural capital. How are we taking care of that which takes care of us? And we need to combine these in understanding how wealthy a society is. And my second point is that we have to take advantage of that momentum that is now being created by what we launched in June, the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. This decade emphasizes that restoring ecosystems is a remarkable solution. Yes, it will slow climate change, but it will also bring back lost or losing biodiversity. It'll create more productive agricultural lands. It'll provide jobs. It'll restore nature's buffer against zoonotic diseases and pandemics. It'll help vulnerable and especially indigenous communities manage their lands and adapt to a changing climate. So ecosystem restoration won't alone solve our problems. As I said, we have to stop destroying ecosystems by reforming all these systems, and we have to stop that destruction right now. But the beauty of restoration is that it can get us back onto a better track. And we now have commitments to restore 1 billion hectares of land, about half of what is degraded. Now we have to deliver. But it also goes for our coastal ecosystems, our coral reefs. That is obviously a dimension of climate change, as we all know. But the second point then is use the momentum by the ecosystem decade that it has been created. The third point is, let's be honest, we need to accelerate finance. We talk a fine talk in the global north, in the richer countries, but to meet the climate, the biodiversity, and the land degradation targets, The financial flows to poorer countries and to nature-based solutions have to triple by 2030 and increase fourfold by 2050. Now, there are many ways to do this. Governments can still allocate funds to nature-based solutions in the COVID-19 recovery packages that they are passing at government level. But they can also redirect harmful subsidies back to nature. They can, away from hydrocarbons, away from chemical and heavy chemical in agriculture, etc. They can leverage private money for restoration and protection of forests and critical ecosystems. And here, just to mention the LEAF initiative supported by Norway, that's exactly what it is doing. So businesses, banks, investors, insurers can and really must reform their operation and financial flows to restore the natural world. And that is not just by generosity or philanthropy, it's in everyone's best interest so that they can continue on a sustainable path. And so to really show solidarity with developing countries as promised, we need to have the developed countries deliver the resources that they have promised seriously and previously, whether it was in the Paris Accord, whether it is on on development assistance, or whether it is to global funds, or indeed to vaccines. As we're looking at vaccine inequity, clearly that is a stark example of the selfishness of the wealthier nations, and that is not the way forward that we can see for planetary sustainability. Now, the fourth point that I want to raise is that we need to join up climate and the biodiversity and the pollution agenda. You spoke in your introduction about the 3 planetary crises, and you can't deal with these separately. We need to deal with them as one. And then that's where nature-based solutions contribute to climate, to biodiversity and pollution goals. So joining these agendas across the 3 Rio conventions will really have an opportunity to deliver. And obviously, as we deliver under the Biodiversity Convention, the post-2020 biodiversity framework, that will leverage ourselves even more. And the 5th point is that we need to bring the gray, i.e. the toxic, and the green together. We need to understand that natural infrastructure can do many of the jobs that today we assume we need built infrastructure to do at a much lower cost with a positive planetary impact. So we need to bring the green and nature into our cities, and that means parks, that means green roofs, that means permeable streets, that means green streets to cool naturally. This is not so much a Norwegian issue, but it is a global issue. This means urban and peri-urban agriculture and aquaculture to increase food security and bring back biodiversity. This means green, blue, and hybrid infrastructure to make our future more sustainable. And my 6th and final point is that these tragic floods that we've seen, the wildfires that we're seeing, the heat waves that we are seeing across the world are not something we would wish on anyone, but for those countries most responsible for the crisis, we must use this moment to make real change. And those countries most responsible are, of course, the G20. They emit nearly 80% of all CO2, but it is also all wealthier countries. And the message is simple. Nobody is safe from the triple crisis, but everyone can do something to stop it through the way we as individuals consume, through our investment choices, including our pension funds, and through the choices we make at the ballot box on who leads us. So we need to take environment with us in all these ways. So friends, we know what we must do in the decades coming and beyond. And here the Norway-backed Making Peace with Nature report has laid out a blueprint for a sustainable world. And now we, UNEP, GRID-Arendal, and Norway must do everything in our power to make sure that the world follows it by raising global ambition and by turning promises into deeds and action. And above all, by prioritizing a healthy natural world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Inga. I know you can't see the audience, but everyone was clapping, and I think you really brought some very good points to us, particularly very clear points on how to move forward and also the role on nature-based solutions. So we'll come back to you, Inga, during the panel discussion. Toyus, would you like to invite our next speaker, please?
Yes, our next speaker, she's Maren Haslet-Holsen. She's from the Ministry of Climate and Environment. She's the State Secretary there. So please come up to the stage, join us here, and tell us a bit about Norway and how we are making peace with nature.
Yeah, you can pick here or one of those, whichever.
Okay.
Wherever you're comfortable.
Here I'm comfortable. Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to join you here today to discuss this very important topic. I'm also glad that the Executive Director of UNEP, Mrs. Inger Andersen, is here to share her valuable insights. I know that you have been working closely with Minister Rotevatn in his capacity as a president for the 5th UN Environment Assembly. And I would like to extend his best regards. The world is dealing with multiple crises, as Inger also mentioned. It's the climate, the nature, and the pollution crisis, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. Nature and the solution it provides is fundamental of all life on Earth and our well-being. Yet nature continues to be lost and destroyed at a rapid rate. We must redefine the way we wish to use and produce energy, consume goods and services, and manage our land. Making peace with nature, the report that lends this event its name, highlights that the solutions to these interconnected challenges can be found in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. The 17 goals are not meant to be solved separately, but rather in a parallel and under a single lens. This means that the action we take and the solution we provide must benefit multiple aspects at the same time. Nature-based solution is a key concept in this regard. By working with, rather than against natural living systems, we can reduce the risk while securing multiple benefits. We must continually share our best policies and practices with each other to figure out how exactly we can be best work with nature. Over the past year, the Norwegian government has launched several initiatives and strategies to protect and restore nature. And I will highlight some of these initiatives in my presentation here now. With nature providing the very foundation of our existence, why have we not been able to take very care of it? Maybe because the value of nature is not properly reflected in the goods and services it provides. In climate policies, the carbon tax has been an efficient tool to reduce emissions. Some stakeholders are argued that putting a price tag on destroying nature could be an effective measure to reduce the loss of biodiversity. However, this is not as straightforward as it may seem, or it may sound. It's difficult to find an estimate which reflects the true value of nature itself. It's hardly possible or even desirable or useful. It is, however, possible to value certain aspects of the solution nature provides that can make a difference for our motivation to protect it. For example, animal pollination plays a vital role as a regulating ecosystem service in nature. Of the 115 leading global crops consumed by humans, more than 75% rely on animal pollination to some degrees. The value of pollination services is estimated to have an annual market value to close to $500 billion. The human cost of that food not being provided cannot be measured. It can be measured. Last week, the Norwegian government launched an action plan to safeguard wild pollinators. Improving their habitats and living conditions is an important aspect in this plan. Furthermore, nature is important for our recreational activities and well-being. Scientists have estimated the value of hiking, boating, and swimming in the Oslofjord area to roughly 25 billion Norwegian kroner every year. It is therefore clear that we need to take better care of the Oslofjord for the benefits of people and our planet. We therefore presented an action plan with several measures to protect and restore the Oslofjord earlier this year. Another initiative that the government has launched this year is a strategy for protecting wetlands. The government will consider ways to ensure net zero loss of wetlands. This work is still underway, and if I can say so myself, it seems very promising. For instance, one measure could be that the entrepreneur is responsible to pay the amount it would cost to restore a wetland area of the same size as destroyed. The monetary estimates are rather uncertain, yet they remind us that the nature is not just nice to have, it's actually something that we rely on and are part of ourselves. We know that land use change is the main driver for loss of nature and biodiversity. A piece of land represents opportunities for economic growth and social well-being by building houses, creating jobs, by providing industrial sites or growing crops. These decisions are often made and regulated at a local level. At a small scale, these changes may not seem that intrusive, but cumulative effects are serious. The government therefore provides financial initiative for local authorities to develop local actions plan to protect nature and biodiversity. Additionally, we are developing a common framework for land use accounting, which will make it easier for local governments to consider nature and biodiversity in their local development strategies. Moving from the local to the global level, collaboration is key to halt the loss of biodiversity and achieve the sustainable development goals. Tropical forests are essential in the battle against climate change and to preserve global biodiversity. Without forests, we risk undermining our food and water supplies. A new coalition called LEAF, that was mentioned earlier, the Lowering Emission by Accelerating Forest Finance Coalition, was launched in April this year. The coalition aims to mobilize at least $1 billion in financing, kicking off what is expected to be one of the largest ever public-private effort to protect tropical forests. Unilever, Amazon, and Airbnb are some of the private sector partners. This is an example of how public-private partnership can benefit both our climate and our biodiversity. We need more collaboration like this in the future. I'm happy that the panelists today represent such a wide group of actors. I'm looking forward to hearing your perspective and ideas on these issues as well. So with that, I thank you for the invitation to share some example of how the Norwegian government is working to implement nature-positive solutions. I'm looking forward to the rest of the arrangement. Thank you.
Thank you, Maren. A bit symbolically, the wind is picking up, making it a bit difficult, but we try to do our best. You could just say put while we move on.
Sure. So now we move to the panel discussion. So the panel discussion has a central question, is how can we transform to a society where all people lead good lives in harmony with nature and within its boundaries? It's quite a big question, but we promise we'll be very specific. So Toyes, would you like to invite the speakers up?
Sure.
Panelists up. Yeah.
In addition to Inger and Maren here, we also have Karen Landmark. She also worked at GRID-Arendal some years ago, but now she is Director of Strategic and Business Development at the energy company Greenstat. We have with us Fridtjof Fossum-Menander. He's the Executive Director for Oceans, Energy and Sustainability at the Research Council. We have Lasse Bjørn. He's a project manager working with Arctic and Environmental Unit of the Sami Council. And last but not least, we have Bård Vegar Solhjell. He's the Director General at NORAD. So please come up, everyone.
So, Karen, we're starting with you, actually.
Thank you,
We're
Björn.
going to quiz you on the report.
I was dreading that. Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Page 67.
67, yeah. But the report states that transforming to low-carbon energy systems with access to clean energy for all is possible. So given your expertise in developing new energy systems, including hydrogen and wind energy, can we quickly transition to such systems here in Norway and globally?
I think we can. We probably won't, because transition is hard. And I think that, especially for a country like Norway, we've been so used, and so for decades we have oil and gas, which is an extremely easy form of energy, and we even don't have to see it. It's offshore. So the transition is difficult in many dimensions, but it's definitely possible, but it won't be without conflict. But maybe I would just say to answer your question that I don't think this transformation we're talking about, Inger is talking about, and Maren is talking about, will be without conflict. And I think it's time to prepare for that kind of conflict and how we deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Karen.
There's a lot of talk about clean energy and transitioning into clean energy. So asking a bit polemically, Lasse, do you think we can engineer ourselves out of the problem? Or do we need to address more fundamental issues with regarding our relation to nature?
I think if we try to engineer us out of this problem, we will reach boundaries time and time again. We will have too little copper, for example. We will have too little minerals. We will have too little areas to expand on. We have some fundamental issues of how our society is organized. We are using way too much in the West, in Norway, too much of our resources, and we're taking it from the next generations. We are lending from future generations. We are losing a lot. I'm from the Sami Council, and I think it's important to note that this is not resources we can use. We are using areas up in the Repparfjord now that are important for food production, for example, and these are important for the biodiversity. We are losing on every front. We are losing indigenous areas. We are losing traditional areas where we are living and we are using for our traditional livelihoods. And this is what the green shift are and how we look at it. It's also something we would say as green colonization, because the indigenous areas are the areas far away from the cities. It's the areas far away from the policymakers, and we are the ones losing time and time again. And when we are losing, nature are also losing.
Thank you. Thank you, Lasse. Fridtjof, we have a question for you, particularly from a research background. And also, I understand you're responsible for green transitioning at the Research Council. So what would you say are the biggest research questions within the field of energy that need urgent attention in Norway?
It's a big question, although it's quite specific, because I think we cannot see Norway as sort of excluded from the rest of the world. And as you just mentioned, it's very important that we have a holistic approach, so we don't create new problems trying to solve one. At the same time, we all know that the climate challenge is extremely urgent, and we need to implement solutions as fast as possible. So this is indeed a dilemma that we need to push on technologies. In many ways, we do need engineering to get out of the problems, but at the same time, we have to make sure we don't create new problems. And that's much easier said than done. And we are trying our best within the Research Council to have a holistic approach. Let me start by saying that. And also should mention that we are I think in a very lucky position that we get funding from almost all ministries in Norway, which also means that we are able to combine funding with sort of different labels into a more holistic approach, and that's one of our key jobs, is to try and do that. So that's very, very important. But when it comes to energy, clearly Norway has a very important role internationally, but we also have a challenge nationally, as we hear about every almost every minute here in Arendal that we need to find new solutions also when it comes to generating income in Norway. So for us working on developing new energy solution research, funding research for that goes hand in hand in sort of linking that with industrial policy, new opportunities for export and so on and so forth. So clearly some of the most important areas for the world when it comes to technology options to reduce emissions, such as renewable ocean energy, particularly ocean wind, CCS, carbon capture and storage, so on and so forth, our hydrogen not to mention, are very, very important area also in Norway, and we have lots of competence in these areas. So these are areas that we do prioritize quite a lot, and we hope to step up in the years to come.
Thank you.
Just a reminder for both you sitting here and at home, we have, if you want to interact a bit, ask some questions, make some comments, you could use the hashtag GRID-AQs. Board, turning to you, if developing or economically developing countries go down the same pathway as the now richer countries in the so-called Western world, we are in quite big trouble, aren't we? So, is it still possible to raise global living standards without further increasing global emissions?
You ask all the small questions here today. If you allow me just to frame the answer a little bit, because I was thinking, listening to Inger Andersen, also that approximately 20 years ago or so, I read the book Collapse by the American biologist Jared Diamond, which is about how some societies have actually experienced ecological collapses. But these were vulnerable and isolated society, Easter Island, the civilization on Greenland 500-600 years ago, things like that. But now, as many of us know, of course, now we are in the period where we as humanity has this capacity to succeed or fail ourselves on behalf of the planet. And the reason why we are there is, it's the challenges that we have are ingrained, or the problems we have are ingrained in the way we have organized society itself. Our energy and land use and everything else. So then the solution also has to be totally ingrained in how we organize and how we work. Not in specific sectors, right? Not only in what's under the climate and environment ministry. I used to work there, but all the others as well. In the whole of our research portfolio, and the same is the thing we have to do in Norad. So what we are trying to do now is not only to do climate and biodiversity development assistance. We do a lot of that on forests and energy and so. We are trying to build solutions to the climate crisis and the nature crisis into everything we do in our development assistance. To build the thinking into it. When we work with health, health is usually, people working with health, they go to different conferences, there's a different ministry, a different world out there. But there are such strong connotations between health and the environment. Of course, we have to build environmental issues into what we're doing on health. And the same when it comes to agriculture and fisheries, all these issues. So the development model we are supporting and working with partners in the Southland has to be a sustainable development model, and thus we have to build it into everything we do. Sorry for the long answer, but it was a big question.
It was.
Maren, we'll come back to you. The UN report calls for a system-wide transformation and a complete paradigm shift in the way our societies are organized. So a lot of people saw the debate, I assume, on Monday evening between the political party leaders. So would you say the measures put forward look like a paradigm shift to you?
No, to be honest, I was worried, and of course now I'm a part of one of those parties that we see the crisis, or all three crises. But of course, there are some major parties in Norway that I think that doesn't take that seriously enough. But of course, we are a democracy, and now it's election time, and I hope and I see also a change in how people are worried. And also, I think the important now regarding this topic, making peace with nature, is that everyone see that these things, all the three crises are fit together. I've been in some discussions regarding forest, for example. That is from someone saying that we have to cut down more forest because that's good for climate. And some of us say that, but we have to see all this, see the climate changing in together with the nature crisis. And that means that there are a lot of biodiversity in the forest that we have to take care of. So these things are not, you cannot take one crisis and see the problem and the solutions for that one problem without seeing the whole. And that is one of the problems in the political discussions now, maybe, that everyone is trying to find solutions for the climate crisis, and they have solutions for that, but they don't see that they also reflect the nature and the pollution at the same time.
Thank you, Maren. I think that's one of the strengths of the Making Peace with Nature report, that it's blended the three together.
I don't know, Lasse, if you saw the debate on Monday evening, but if not, in general, the political climate in Norway, do you think it moves towards a paradigm change? Are you encouraged, discouraged by the current talking points of our politicians?
I think we have to go to a paradigm change. We need to change fundamentally how we look at society, as also said in the report. But I'm afraid that we are walking towards something where we're talking just about climate change, where everything is acceptable because of climate change, where mines are acceptable because of climate change, where forestry, as we see in Sweden right now, large demonstration is accepted because of climate change. And we're not looking at the whole system, we're not looking at the biodiversity and about the livelihoods of the people actually living in the areas. And that makes me scared. That makes me scared because why are we really trying to stop climate change? What are the main reasons? For me, it's clear. It's to protect nature. It's to protect the biodiversity. It's to protect the areas and the livelihoods of the people living here. And how do we do that if we are ruining those areas? It doesn't make sense to me. And this is why it's important to look at the indigenous people rights, to look at the biodiversity when we look at the climate crisis, and not have one crisis make the other one worse.
Karen, if we continue with the theme of this paradigm...
To answer if that looks like a paradigm shift?
Sorry. No, we have a separate question for you.
Okay.
So if we continue with the theme of paradigm shift, and I know you work in the private sector now, although you've had many hats. So the private sector is often described as the engine of growth for economies, taking into account that we need to decrease emissions, reduce land use and pollution, and tackle growing inequality. Do you think the private sector needs to change its model?
Well, I think I will emphasize Bård's point, because this is really about how we organize society, and private sector is just a part of society. And I think that division between different institutions doesn't help us in the conversation we need to have now. I'm all in favor of it. I can be a little bit personal, because I think I've tried everything now. I've tried research. I tried organizations, and now I'm trying to work with change from the inside of the capitalist system, which is interesting, but it's all interlinked. So I think that that's how, private sector cannot solve this problem. It's too important for that. And as long as the financial system works in a way that private sector is able to make money out of ruining nature, they will continue to do so. They will probably have some nice projects on side, like Amazon or any other companies that we like to kind of see that they are taking responsibility. But it's the core business is still their core business. And so I think, speaking from private sector needs regulations and also good incentives, and also to work with different institutions in society, research and organizational and politics. So yes, that's my. It's don't give it only to us. No.
Thank you.
Fridtjof, I saw a question here earlier from the audience, and they commented that research has again and again shown that economic growth has never been coupled from emissions at a satisfactory level. So what's your thought on that? Can we keep on growing? Can we build something new that enable us to keep growing without and reduce emissions efficiently, or do you think that's even possible?
No, I don't think that's impossible, but I think it's proven to be very difficult, as we've been discussing this for decades, going back to limits to growth, which is, what is it now, 50 years ago. So we've been aware of the challenge, but to a varying degree that we've been able to solve that. I think what we see now is, yes, there is a push for decoupling, and the question is, you have to sort of look at the decoupling that you can get from technological change, sort of the engineering part of it, and what you can get from sort of system transformation, behavioral changes, and so on. And I think you need sort of all factors contributing. And if you look at global data, you see that indeed there is a decoupling now, but by far not enough from economic growth and carbon emissions. But we also see that this has been varying over time. Typically, when energy prices, oil prices are low, it's harder to get the decoupling of basic economics as well, working on this. This change going, I think we have, again, to think about this in a holistic approach. It's a word that is maybe easy to use, but it really is important. We see, for example, if you look at net zero scenarios that are maybe quite sort of technology-oriented, they still show that we need to massively increase the rate of energy efficiency in the world. The last 10 years, I think the average rate of improvement of efficiency, it's sort of the decoupling factor, has been 1.2% per year. But we need to accelerate that to 4.2% per year, not in 10 or 20, 30 years, but starting from today. So it's a massive change that is needed, and that includes, we have to push on technology, we have to push on behavioral changes, and so on and so forth. But I think when we talk about decoupling, it's very important to distinguish between the decoupling we can get from reduced energy use, resource use, because that also saves nature, impact on nature. Whether we do the decarbonization on the supply side, which we also need, but that always will have an impact on nature. So I think it's very, very important that we also in the debate when we discuss climate change, that we have focus on what we can do sort of on the demand side, both in terms of technology, but not at least when it comes to sort of system transformation and behavioral changes. And of course, policy regulations, very important when it comes to industrial activities.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Building a bit on consumption, going back to your board, another person watching asked, can we make peace with nature as there is an increasing push to build more houses and cabins in previously uninhabited land? So I was curious to kind of change that question a bit and ask you, what can we learn as a high-consuming society? What can we learn from societies that live with less material wealth than us?
Quite a few things, actually. I think, learning goes always in a way. But I think the first thing we have to accept is that there's no moral way or no other way we can tell developing countries, and especially, the least developed countries, say, don't develop, because we have this issue called climate change. And also we have a huge biodiversity issue. It's just not possible. And they will develop. For instance, the IEA says that the African continent will double its energy use from now till 2040, right? A much bigger growth than any other continent. And we will probably also see a huge growth in many businesses and agriculture and fisheries and so on. So that's why the real challenge is, how do we do land use and energy totally differently? Increasing productivity, adapting or new methods, adapting better to climate change, making it more resilient, all these things. But there are also some things to learn, and especially we see that in our work with forests and with climate and forests, that indigenous people have ways of preserving the forest, living in, working, in the forests, that there is a lot to learn from, and ways of also, there's a dependency on nature that has created many standards and norms that are different, and they're not worse. I mean, they're often very efficient, smart ways of doing things and organizing local communities. So we have seen a change, especially on the work we do with rainforests, which is a big part of Norwegian development assistance. We've seen a change in the way we work. We work a lot with civil society. We've changed from, at least gradually, from big NGOs, global NGOs, to looking for local partners that actually has this local understanding and knowledge. And we put a lot of weight on working, for instance, indigenous communities and forest people. And I think there's probably more to take from this. We also, in the work we do also in agriculture, on the African continent, for instance, most people are local farmers. So farming is really, small farming is really, smallhold farming is really, really important. We are looking for partners that are more integrated into the culture and the technology and the way to work, because they have a better understanding also of how to transform and develop, at least to bring perspectives of what kind of productivity change can work, for instance, in the local community. So yes.
And I think building on that, it makes sense to move to the Sami Council in you, Lasse. Is what can indigenous knowledge teach kind of this consuming society that we live in?
I think you can teach a lot to the society as a whole. I think it's also important to note that indigenous knowledge is knowledge about an area for generation, for hundreds of thousands of years. You have learned lots of how that ecosystems are working. It's also a problem with modern science, is that you look at the small stuff and you try to say something about the whole system, but the indigenous science is looking at an ecosystem over a long time and know not only how to interact with it, but also maybe how can you change stuff in that society. So it's lots of knowledge that are here, that's just not up for grabs, but it's something you can use in how to develop those regions, to how to look at the rainforest, for example. How can we use that area more efficiently? Then you need to look at indigenous knowledge in that area, and the indigenous people need to have control over how to develop that region. That's the most important issue, important point to make here. I would also like to note, from indigenous perspective, we have no wilderness. When we're talking about nature, it's talking about areas where humans have lived and lived with nature for generations. And it's important because when people talk about nature, it's something that's over there. But no, it's not. It's something we're living with. And I think that's a perspective that's important to take when we're talking about new solutions. And when we're talking about nature-based solutions, it's really solutions in where we're living. It's not something that's new. It's something really, really old.
Bård, if we go back to you, we all know the Paris Agreement ties all countries together now. But are there any specific areas where Norway should play a leading role internationally in the coming decade to advance cooperation meeting both climate and biodiversity targets? I know Maren has mentioned already forests, but perhaps you'd like to elaborate.
Yeah, maybe 3-4 examples. And I will emphasize that there is a climate crisis and a nature crisis. I mean, looking at what the Nature Panel has done, and I see Professor Vigdis Vanvik here has written a lot about this. I'm even more. I mean, it could be more worrying in a way, in a long-term perspective. First, we are a global leader on forest and rainforests, really, and it is essential. And it's also a field where there's no big conflict between what we do in climate and you know, on biodiversity when it comes to forests. Mostly climate nature solutions that are good for both, even though, you know, there can be some difficult nuances. And we are strengthening that. Second, we are doing a lot, but we can do a lot more on energy. Partly because Norway has a lot of capital. I mean, and we can raise capital from the state and private capital, but also we have competence. We have a strong competence on hydropower, on other renewables. And we, from Norad's side, we have proposed to build something we call energy for development, to work with institutions, you know, building institutions, not only raising capital, but how do you build a renewable energy system, for good laws for that, for carbon pricing, all these things, because many developing countries will develop, but whether they take a fossil way or a renewable way will make all the difference. And third, I would say adaptation, climate adaptation. I think we sometimes forget that. Let's say we make the 2 degrees target, which is really, really hard. That's a crisis in itself for many countries, and especially for many developing countries, economies that are vulnerable. And then, of course, building nature and biodiversity and land use into everything we do is a challenge. We have a way to go before we have done that well enough, but we can play a role internationally also in doing that even better.
Thank you. Fridtjof, I know you wanted to give a comment, maybe 1 minute?
Yes, I just wanted to highlight the importance of science, because we're in the midst of many crises now. We're in the midst of the pandemic as well, as we all know. And I think we all have really understood how extremely important science is when it comes to finding the solution that we need in a crisis. And I think we need to think the same way when it comes to the crisis that we're talking about in this session. So I just wanted to highlight that, because science clearly is to get the knowledge, but we often think about science takes a long time to develop the knowledge base and so on and so forth. But indeed, science can and has to also deliver when we are in a big hurry, both when it comes to knowledge, but clearly also when it comes to designing solutions that we need to solve the crisis. And maybe the most important part is that the international collaboration part of science. Science is almost per definition international, and the collaboration that we can get through science collaboration goes across borders, across political systems, if we design it well. And I think that's extremely important, also in a development perspective. That we, as a rich country in Norway, with very good scientists, we really should take a big responsibility in moving international collaboration in these different areas forward.
Thank you.
I see that we're running a bit out of time, but we have one question here that says land use neutrality can be a solution. If you build an industry plant in a forest, you must restore equivalent forest nearby. This may be so expensive that it's better to put the plant on an old landfill instead. What does the panel think about this? I don't know, Maren, it touched a bit upon what you talked about earlier. Maybe you quickly want to address it?
Yeah, because we know that a lot of the decisions on land use are taken on the local level, at least in Norway. Basically, if there's not the big issues, we're building bit for bit the land, and the reason why it is because it's cheaper to build on not used land or nature. So the possible of putting a price on nature and how to work with that, that's an issue that we are talking about and that we are working on and that we have pinpointed. But it's and now I'm looking for the it's more knowledge on how to do that actually, because nature, we're not used on putting a name tag on nature because everyone is, we love nature, but the price on it is difficult. So I don't know if there are other in the panel that can answer how we can move forward on putting out, and it's also the private sector and the researchers. How can we do that?
30 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and then I think we have to
I
move.
just want to pick up on that. At the Research Council, we had no separate calls for the last few years, focusing on land use changes, where we actually do, as I said earlier on, we combine funding from different ministries and address land use from sort of different angles. But we combine that in a common call, and I think that the knowledge and the response that we're getting through those calls have been very, very important when it comes to developing more knowledge on this on the Norwegian level.
Lasse?
I think the very idea of putting price tag on nature, it's like putting price tag on your culture, and the price tag, it's going to be very, very hard. And I'm not seeing how, okay, if you pay 10 million, then you can lose your culture. It's an okay way to look at it. It's hard to, but every solution that makes it harder for people to ruin our nature and areas, we need to look at it, but I don't think it's one solution. We can say, okay, this is okay and this is good. So.
And Karen, you had some final thoughts?
It changed a bit in the conversation now, but we work with wind energy, which is extremely controversial in our time, just because of the land use, and it should be controversial. But one way we approach that is that we build smaller windmills on areas that is already affected by humans. So I think it's about doing things a little bit smarter. And I think that modern life, we forgot something really essential. And it's about getting back to that. And putting a price on nature, I kind of agree with you, Lasse. It doesn't really make sense to me, because you then use a financial and economic model to kind of just, I don't know, I think it's more emotional in a way. I'm not sure yet. I'm working on it, and I do believe in science. Yeah.
Quick.
No, I mean, it's a bit out of my daily work, but I used to work with these issues. And remember, we do put a price on nature, but the price is zero.
Yeah, that's true.
So the alternative is not pricing it, because today you can just build something if it's allowed. So that's, I mean, that has to be taken into account. So I'm more positive on looking into these things, also because neutrality is a different thing from pricing, right? Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know, Björn, if you got the answer to the question you posted in the beginning here. It seems, at least we got a lot of interesting perspectives, and I think we just need to give the word to Peter Harris.
Yeah. But we'd like to thank all the panelists, and unfortunately we're trying to stick to the 1 hour, so we can't really debate anymore, but thank you very much. Yeah, I think this should work for you.
Well, thank you. This never happens at my house where I get the last word, but I have the pleasure of thanking all of the speakers for their presentations. I can't go through everyone's presentation to come up with a summary, but I think, Board, you mentioned that civilization will succeed or fail based on what we do now in these next years. And that's a very sobering thought. But I take away from the speakers also hope that we can make a difference. We can change. We can take a path that will lead to a better future for the next generations to come. And I hope very much that is the case. So without any more words from me, I think we've run out of our time. But I'd like to also recognize and thank Torjus and Bjorn for their contribution in hosting the event. At GRID-Arendal, we are very fascinated and interested in these topics, and we would love to continue talking for the next days. But we've run through our time. But thank you very much, all of you, for your time and your contribution and a very interesting discussion. And all the rest of the day for you to enjoy here at Arendal. And what a view. What a fantastic location. Okay, thanks very much.